how did you come across this concept and why is it important to understand it?
Sure. Well, I think at Atlas Network, we have always been focused on learning and listening from local NGOs, what they think are the priorities on the ground for achieving economic development. So that has always been part of our practice. But as I became more interested in understanding what the current debates are in the broader world of economic development, I realized that what many people were grappling with as we started to realize that we didn't have any good evidence that on the whole, our traditional aid programs were effective. And in fact, we had lots of evidence that they were sometimes doing more harm than good, and they were rife with corruption and inefficiency. And so there became this big debate about how can we fix traditional aid. And one of the challenges I think that has prevented us from really making big headway on that is this idea of the outsider's dilemma, which is if my intervention, though well-intentioned, might be disruptive to the viable path to prosperity that would otherwise take place, then not only am I probably not being very effective, but I could be doing, like I said, more harm than good. And that's extremely troubling when you look at people at the World Bank or IMF or here in my country, USAID. They are by and large, from my experience, really smart, really well-intentioned people, really trying to make the world a better place. And yet, if you limit your solutions to only those things that fit that model of the outsider having the answer and bringing it to the local community, then you're actually very limited in the kind of impact you can have. Alternatively, if you partner with local NGOs, such as Center for Civil Society, and listen and learn from them what they see in their local context is the right way forward, you're much more likely to achieve change that really affects real people. And it also has many other benefits. And I'll just mention one, which is I am troubled by the extent to which we sometimes, as outsiders, undermine local democracy when we come in with billions of dollars or millions of dollars, and we change the incentives of elected leaders in terms of who they're listening to and who their constituencies are. And if you're coming in with your own solutions and the elected leaders listen to you because you're bringing a lot of money along with you, what does that say about the consent of the governed and the input and participation of local democracy?
That's a very important point. So if traditional aid is the wrong answer in a sense, what is the right answer? How can we actually help the poor all across the world?
Well, I think one of the ways to approach this is to think about knowledge in terms of what types of knowledge are useful in a centralized approach and what types of knowledge are important in a decentralized approach. I think the World Bank provides tremendous value insofar as it gathers and disseminates information. The Doing Business report, I think, is a very useful piece of information that can look at each country and get a sense of how hard or easy they make it for people to thrive. That's good information to have. But it should be the decision-making needs other types of knowledge. When you think about yourself or your family or your cousins, each person has their own knowledge of what their days are like, what opportunities are in front of them, what they value the most, what trade-offs they would make considering all of the different options. That's the kind of knowledge that's actually really important for achieving an enduring economic prosperity, because it is in those decisions that sustainable solutions are found. And that's the part that gets missed when we look only at the centralized academic approach. So let me just boil that down then to what can we do differently going forward? We have to unleash and honor. We call it, we have a new website called Dignity Unbound. We need to honor the dignity of the individual's knowledge and their role in discovering the solution, not being given the solution, because their solution is going to be much more permanent. And so we can do that by supporting groups like Center for Civil Society. This is why we follow our model, because local knowledge from local NGOs is identifying what are the systemic barriers that limit the use of that knowledge. I think it's actually very exciting to see how much good can be done at the local level when local NGOs identify things like, why is it so hard to join the formal sector? Why do we have to have so many government offices involved in giving permits for things? Are these things really of benefit to society, or are they actually holding a lot of people back? And during this time of the pandemic and so much uncertainty that we've all seen, nobody has known for sure, X, Y, or Z about what to do. It's in times of uncertainty that it's even more important to allow decentralized knowledge to act. And because in that way, what we're doing is we're allowing a lot of experimentation and then learning. And we can replicate what's working that we see that our neighbors are doing, et cetera. And we can cooperate in that way, rather than have one big answer from one expert. That's actually very risky, because if they're wrong, not only is everyone worse off, but we also lost the opportunity to learn anything because we had a one size fits all approach. So whether it's dealing with the pandemic or trying to achieve economic growth and shared prosperity, again, I think the approach has to start with human dignity and recognizing that the individual's choices have to be part of the model. They're so important.
Thank you. So there was a very interesting quote that I read in the book Philanthropists. There are no poor people, there are people living in poor places. And the reason why the places are poor is largely because there are barriers to entry for small businesses and the lack of good institutions. So how important do you think are institutions in building the right kind of atmosphere, in a sense, for people who are poor to become richer?
Institutions are critical. And when we talk about institutions, we should keep in mind that we're talking about not just the formal legal structures, but also the cultural norms, the ways that we think about social cooperation. All of these things that govern the choices that we make can have a huge impact on whether we're prosperous. We know from research that people who live in poor places, if they move to somewhere that is prosperous, they do not remain poor. So that tells you that there's nothing wrong with the people who are living in a poor place. They are not poor in the sense that they themselves have nothing to offer. It's that the rules, quote unquote, the rules of the game where they live, for one reason or another, can prevent people from getting ahead. Can you secure property rights easily? Can you prove what you own? Can you get access to credit to collateralize what you own? Can those sort of questions be dealt with swiftly in the court system and predictably? Or is it more a function of who you know and who you bribe? All of these things have devastating effects. So institutions are very important. And the interesting thing that we've learned is that institutions are not, they're idiosyncratic. They may share some things in common, but we can't take the institutions of Germany and go plant them in a country in Africa and expect it to work. Why? Because institutions and the people that live within them, they actually interrelate and affect each other. So they have to emerge locally. That doesn't mean we can't learn from each other. We should absolutely be learning from other countries and what's working and adapt that to our own local conditions. And this is why you have a big debate right now about the failure of exporting liberal democracies since the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Francis Fukuyama famously predicted in 1991. This is the end of history, meaning we are no longer questioning what model of governance is best. We're all just going to live in liberal democracies now. Well, that hasn't worked. And the latest hypothesis about why is because we tried to impose it, not always against people's will. It was a cooperative exercise in many countries. But if we come in as outsiders, again, if we come in as outsiders and say, here's our stock exchange, here's all the rules that we use for our stock exchange, go build the exact same thing here, you find that that is at odds with the actual norms and habits and cultural expectations of different societies. So the better path is, yes, to support and promote liberal democracy. It's the best institution for human rights on record. But it does need to be a function of choice and a function of the local tapestry of culture and religion and traditions. We have to understand that human dignity element, that we have to honor local culture. That doesn't mean it's not going to change. Culture is always changing, but who decides if it's going to change? The people themselves should decide.
So what I've gathered up to now is there are two important components: local knowledge and local dignity and culture. But beyond that, there is also, the issue of, even if we want to make the changes, the capacity of the state or the government in countries, which may or may not be up to the mark to deliver that kind of change. So how important is building state capacity or state capability in driving development?
Well, there's a whole thread of research and practice on this out of Harvard, and I've gotten to know the people who run that, and they come in. Let's say they come and work with a bureaucracy in country X. They want to be respectful of local conditions, local laws, etc. So they don't have a prescription about what kinds of things government should be up to, but they do, as a matter of practicality, suggest that the exercise first look at what are the core functions that are most important that this government body should be doing, and set aside anything that is not part of that core function so that you can focus on improving your capacity in that one area. Now, I am someone who thinks that you should probably never reintroduce those other functions because they are not part of the core function of government. That, of course, is something for people to decide in a liberal democracy for themselves. But when you're faced with very inefficient, underperforming government bodies, what you've got to do, I think, is start with the core functions. If you are a land titling office, you should first look at, do we have accurate archives and transparency around the titles that we are recording, and can we be responsive in a timely manner so that people are able to secure their property rights in a court of law? If not, you shouldn't be doing anything else. You should be focusing on that issue alone. And I do believe that a functioning land titling office, a functioning court system, a functioning parliament, we do want these things to have competence and capability. But that should not be conflated with big government or growth of government. It should be a lesson in actually stripping out the kinds of things that government shouldn't be involved in the first place.
So to limit government, but make sure that it does its core functions the best.
Yes.
There is this term that I think Harvard calls isomorphic mimicry, which is practicing, success by copying what the peers do, which works. In a sense, looking at best practices and doing that. What are the drawbacks in it? Why does it work and why does it not work?
Well, so when I spoke before about the frustrations that the broader development community has had in the last 30 years in trying to build the institutions from the outside, that's where this term isomorphic mimicry becomes useful, because if you think about in nature, you might have a butterfly that evolves to appear like it has the eyes of an owl, right? So that is a predator deterrence. That's a way to hopefully get away from being eaten, because a predator sees that and goes, oh, that's an owl, I can't eat that. That applied to institutions means if outsiders are building institutions, we tend to build them to just look like our institutions. And the nature, again, of institutions is that they are not this system that lives in a vacuum. It's a system that must be a function of the people who are going to be governed by those institutions and to account for the norms and the history. And so that analogy is useful in underscoring just how important it is that we can learn from each other, and we should learn from each other. We should not be sort of like, sharing ideas is always very good. It's what power and influence have we created for ourselves inappropriately in the adoption of those ideas. In the countries themselves, through the institutions of liberal democracy, should be reforming and leading reform to strengthen the institutions along the lines that we've discussed. If you say, well, that's a rich country, let's just do everything they've done, we have 30 years of evidence that is not an effective way to go about it.
Yeah, thank you. Please keep your videos and audio off. That way we can focus on what Matt is talking about. And there is a link called Slido, which one of my colleagues will share in chat, where you can actually put your questions through. And then you can vote for the questions, and I'll ask one or two more questions, and then we will move to, the questions that participants are asking. Atlas is, at its core, a network of think tanks around the world. So if you were to give advice to think tanks on how to be successful, how would you be able to measure that success? How would you be able to make sure that we as individual local think tanks around the world are successful in achieving our aims?
That's a great question. And it's one that we have concerned ourselves with for many years now, because we don't want to make the same mistakes that we're pointing out that Big 8 is making, meaning we don't want to centralize what it means to be a great think tank and prescribe out to others what that is. That's a way to limit the experimentation and growth of the power of think tanks. And we're big believers that think tanks are, quote unquote, an undervalued resource in civil society, because if you can achieve systemic change, that is going to have the most impact for the most people. So our approach is to think about the network very much as a network. And if you study innovation and innovation diffusion and the way that great ideas come about, it's a bit serendipitous. You can't really just, there's no recipe for it, but you can make it more likely by getting really great people together and having them form professional friendships and learn from each other, and then challenge each other to do more and do better. Most think tanks are nonprofits, and sometimes not having the profit motive is can be a disadvantage in terms of being certain that you're creating value and that you are on the right track. We think you can substitute for that by having the links among think tanks be very robust, so that you know what each other is doing and you can learn from each other and compare yourself to each other. And so any new think tank starting out, it's the same idea as the comments we were making about institutions. Yes, go out and learn as much as you can about what others are doing, but you don't necessarily need to copy exactly what they're doing. You might have your own vision, or you might adapt it to what's going to work in your country. We do a lot of our information sharing via case study, where we say, hey, look, here is what this think tank did. Here's the things that they identified were important. Here's how they approached it. This is their strategy. Here's what happened. Here's what they learned along the way. And then we invite people to ask themselves, what do you think about this approach? Would this work in your country? Why or why not? What would you do differently? The idea of the entrepreneur, I think we can expand it to apply to in so many new places, including in sort of the pursuit of your own success in life as a person and as a think tank leader. So I think of think tank leaders as very entrepreneurial. And in that sense, entrepreneurs must be the ones deciding, not their donors, not government bodies. They have the opportunity to develop a vision based on local knowledge for how to achieve the institutional improvements that are going to expand an inclusive market for all people in their country. And so we invite think tank leaders all the time to learn what they can from others, but to make sure that they are leading in what they think is important to do.
Thank you. So my last question actually is on Atlas Network's Coach, Compete, and Celebrate model. And it's kind of a follow-up to the earlier one. How does that work for new think tanks?
Sure. So the Coach, Compete, Celebrate model is the name we've given to what I was just describing, which is creating a series of resources that based on social science research are likely to increase the probability of achieving excellence in a network and diffusing ideas and inspiring a lot of new ideas. So we do, under the Coach banner, we do training. Under the Compete banner, we do competitive grant making. And then Celebrate, we do awards where we recognize the biggest successes and then use those successes as curriculum to put back into the coach portion of our training opportunities for think tanks. So any think tanks out there who want to get more involved, if you're not a partner, you can apply for partnership on our website. We have lots of free online trainings available, and then we have competitive training opportunities where you apply and you may be selected to participate. But our mantra is there's something for everyone. If you go and check out our website, we should be able to provide you something that could be of use.
Great. That's actually, I go to your website pretty often and learn a lot from it. One of the things that we haven't discussed today are the case studies themselves that are in the book. But I think the case studies are all on Atlas's website. So yes. I would encourage everybody to go on the website, go through the case studies of a variety of organizations around the world that have succeeded. CCS is also in there. And we talk about how we helped people remove the Zubair's story of removing the business startup amount. Gosh,
Oh, yeah, the
I've seen
minimum
it
capital
so many times,
requirement.
I forget what it is. The startup capital.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an inspiring story that many other think tanks have benefited from learning more about what CCS did. And it certainly represents the kind of policy that um, can have so many negative impacts, and it's hard to wrap your head around. So by eliminating that requirement, I think what CCS achieved was two things. One, it took away an arbitrary barrier that an entrepreneur does not need the government to be second guessing whether or not they're prepared to start a business. And then two, it eliminated an opportunity for somebody to extract a bribe within the system, which can, of course, also slow economic growth. Again, if our goal is to eliminate poverty, the solution is to give people as many choices and as much freedom as possible in the marketplace, combined with strong institutions that protect them from violence and from fraud and from theft. And so those core functions are what government should be focusing on, and everything else they would do well to really ask themselves whether all of this extra regulation is needed, because anytime you regulate, you may be preventing some of the viable paths to prosperity that would be discovered had it not been for the inelegant, clumsy effect of bad law.
Quite true. And we've seen that many, many, many times in India. I want to, before I open the questions up, what I'd like to do is announce that we have a Hindi version of Poverty and Freedom, which has been translated by my colleague Avinash Chandra, and it's available on our website. So you can go to azadi.me, which is our Hindi website. And through that, you can, I'll put the website down here. You can download a Hindi version of Poverty and Freedom. Anas, would you want to share screen and ask questions?
Yeah, thank you, Yazid. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Matt, for that wonderful session. It was indeed enlightening. We have a flurry of questions, as you can see on your screen, and many have been upvoted as well. So the first question that we have is, why do think tanks work on a donation model? Why don't they make business models and seek investment?
Good question. So there are examples of think tanks who do work on a business model, meaning they do a combination of research for contract, and then they may extend some of that work to priorities that they've identified. I think the reason why the donation model has been more common is because there is a tension when you create a tie between service for hire and the priority agenda for the organization and the kind of output that you're seeking. So, you can imagine that many people who are doing research for hire, they have certain priorities that they're interested in, and those may or may not match with the priorities that are the core purpose or the mission of the organization. So you run into that tension. Again, some people have navigated that, but I think the most successful think tanks in terms of growth and size are those that have worked on a donation model, because it allows them to sell a vision of what they're trying to achieve to a group of philanthropists, and then stay focused on that vision.
Thanks a lot. Just a follow-up question on that. Do you think it also has a lot to do with the kind of policies that a country has? I mean, that think tanks can only work on a non-profit basis.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking for, as an organization in the US, our tax code very much has influenced the way that nonprofits define their work, the model that they use to raise funds. So that has a big impact on that. It doesn't prevent anyone from doing a for-profit model think tank, and those do exist. Um, and but again, I think when it comes down to the kind of relationship and the influence that is ideal, um, I think that's why we've seen the donation model more common. But as I said before, we are always concerned about limiting the possibilities that others in the network may see, and so we certainly don't take a position against one model versus another. We think that experimentation and trying new things and learning from each other is the most effective way forward. So we certainly wouldn't discourage anybody, but that's my sense of why it's more common to see the donation model.
Thanks a lot for that, Matt. The next question, as you can see, is Matt advocates decentralization in current time of uncertainty, but won't a decentralized approach run into collective action hurdle?
So I understand the instinct for the question. I think it's always important to remember that we are not comparing what we can imagine in a decentralized model with the ideal centralized model that we hope for. I think if we look at the pandemic, I am certainly someone who wears a mask and doesn't mind wearing a mask, and any small cost thing I can do to limit my exposure and those around me, I'm happy to do. But I'm not sure that adoption of these kinds of habits is necessarily optimized under a mandate model. And furthermore, I think looking at the broader question of finding solutions and vaccines, et cetera, I think this year has shown us just how fragile and brittle our large institutions are. And putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, is a big risk. I much prefer a hedge model where we allow more freedom in a decentralized way. I mean, we had people here in the US who were pursuing solutions, and the FDA was making it almost impossible for them to bring and create that value for potential opt-in by the social market. These are the things that you can look at a centralized model and feel a sense of false satisfaction that everything's under control, but of course it's not. And so we have to compare what those trade-offs really are. So I think collective action has some challenges to it, and it has some advantages to it. And I think in this case, when there is so much uncertainty, you're always, I'm more comfortable with decentralization in times of uncertainty. You would do the same thing if you were, a market investor, and that can always kind of be very revealing when you look at, where people have to put their money where their mouth is. And, a hedge model is, conventional wisdom in that environment where you don't put all your eggs in one basket. You need to see what's going to work. And I'll also point to, Bill Gates, through the Gates Foundation, funded 7 different vaccines, knowing that at best 1 or 2 might work. That's the kind of hedge model that I think is also important to apply to matters as serious as life and death, and not making everybody subject to the best guess of the most technical expert that we have available. We should listen to the experts. I strongly believe in expertise and technical expertise. But of course, we know that any one person or any one body is pretty limited in knowing the implications or the or the best ways of navigating the use of that information that they possess.
Interesting. You talked about the example of Bill Gates, and we have a question here. How should outsiders establish institutions in poor countries? What does the process look like in real life?
Well, there's a great movement right now that has a few different names, and I hope it grows and gets even bigger. But there's a really diverse group of people who recognize that local institutions and the growth of local organizations is probably the best way forward, rather than to have institutions from wealthy countries expand or franchise or set up shop. I mean, there's always been, at least in the last 25 years, an acknowledgement that local coordination is important and getting local buy-in is important. And some of the ways that that's been manifested is, to establish more field offices, to have more people on the ground. So you have, maybe an Oxfam or some large organization like that making a concerted effort to assign more of its people outside of the headquarters and, out in the field. I think that's certainly probably a good thing, but it's probably not transformative. It doesn't really get at the heart of this. So I don't think outsiders should go establish nonprofits in local places. What they should do is they should find and connect with local people who have a vision for change and support them and support the capacity building of that local NGO. I personally think that is probably the most effective way to achieve the kind of systemic change we hope to see. We have so much tragic evidence of well-intentioned outsiders coming in and trying to solve economic problems for others. That's not how economics works. People have to, the knowledge of the individual, the tacit knowledge that's not in a book, it's in their heads, it's in their hearts. That is an important piece for finding the enduring solutions to poverty. And so I would trust a locally run institution, and if there were outsiders who wanted to help, I would tell them, go support their vision. You can still hold them accountable. You can still say, tell me how you're going to measure your success, and then I'm going to hold you to that, or at least want to get a full report on what you learned. That's important to have accountability, but I think the leadership should be local.
Thanks a lot on that. We have a question by Yuvraj, sort of, as you can see on the screen. He said, institution mimicry may not work everywhere, but Western economic institutions of private property have virtually worked everywhere, he says. Political institutions haven't. So how do you see this situation?
Yeah, let me make a distinction here, and I appreciate the question because I don't want to be misunderstood on this point. The point I'm making is not that private property as an institution is idiosyncratic and may not be appropriate in certain places. I'm pretty well persuaded that it's critically important, but the institutions that govern it, how to transition from whatever exists now to something that is more reliable, stronger, and useful, that process of change is going to require that local knowledge of how to get there and what it looks like. What is improvement look like? Because it might be incremental. Look, I think we have examples that we wanted to herald in the past of where, if you're king for a day, what would you do? And there are examples where that has happened, and on paper, a lot of that change looked very positive. But ultimately, if it isn't a function of the people that are going to be governed by those institutions, you're going to run into this imitation problem. If you want to read more about that, I have a book review coming out in the next Cato Journal of a book by Krastev and Holmes called The Light That Failed, where they detail this distinction I'm making, which is not that the institutions of liberal democracy are unique to a particular place. It's that the process of building those institutions in an enduring way, we can't do it the way we've been doing it. I mean, there are lots of examples of private property systems that have been imposed from the outside, and they have not been as successful. There are some cases of progress, absolutely. But I think if we want the transformative change, then the key piece is going to be understanding the nature of change for people and institutions and the relationship between them. And again, there's lots of examples of trying to create Western institutions in other places, and you go back 5-10 years later, it's a mess.
Thank you for that. So this brings to a more broad question about the challenges that think tanks generally face, and Atlas has been working with many think tanks around the world. So what are some of those common challenges that you always witness from partner organizations with regard to public policy and working with government?
Yeah, I think there are a few common challenges. A think tank is such a broad term, and that's a good thing, because again, there's lots of different ways to go about trying to fulfill your mission. If you're looking at short-term change, meaning you're hoping to tackle problems that have some incremental solutions that are possible now, then you have to consider whether you're also laying groundwork for long-term change. So this short-term, long-term trade-off is a common question that, again, every leadership group and board needs to wrestle with and define for themselves. I do think that we have not yet truly figured out fundraising in a way that could increase our capacities significantly. One of the key challenges is not having any undue influence on your agenda. So, an organization that is predominantly funded by a government agency is going to have a lot of undue influence, in my opinion. It's the same as if they had one single private donor. That private donor could respect and understand the boundaries of where their influence should stop, but that can be a gray area. So the funding structure and the growth of fundraising is a common challenge. Looking at, again, going back to the short-term, long-term, the other trade-off is that if you are too effective in certain ways in the short term, you may not have a long-term brand. So, making sure that people understand you as an ideas organization and not a partisan organization. You may have certain allies on a certain issue, but you may, not be allied with those same groups on a different issue. And that's, I think, healthy. If, you certainly don't want to be associated with a particular party, a political party, or a certain special interest. So that independence is a shared priority that I think all think tanks need to make sure that they're paying close attention to.
Thanks so much on that, Matt. One question, and just one final question, and we have been discussing about public policy and government, and most of the time the reference point is government action? And the question you can see is, how can citizens, an individual citizen and in communities engage constructively with their local democracies to facilitate social and economic mobility? What is the role of an individual citizen in the think tank model per se?
Well, I think, a think tank broadly is trying to be educational. They're trying to, like any institution, they are trying to centralize knowledge, the type that's appropriate to centralize, and then disseminate it broadly and effectively. So individual citizens are part of of that audience. And I think those who are particularly inclined to make a difference should engage with both their local government bodies and with their local civil society, which includes think tanks, and see what role that they would like to play. I think more and more think tanks, one trend that I think is very positive is they are looking to diversify the sources of their own knowledge by building relationships with different communities. And as I said in the beginning, listening and learning as much as they can. We can have economic theories about, the challenges of low-income communities, but who better than to teach us than those who are living in those places? And if we can build some trust and show that, we really are interested in learning from them, I think that is going to really further enrich the opportunities for a think tank to reflect real viable solutions that are going to have a big impact. So I think any citizen that cares about these issues and wants to get involved, I think make sure that you are paying attention to what civil society or organizations exist, hold them accountable, give them feedback on what they're doing. And you never know, there may be an organization that you want to start, whether it's grassroots or think tank or in any number of important things. I'll just end by saying that in the most recent Acemoglu and Robinson book, which I recommend highly, called The Narrow Corridor, the argument they make there is that a successful country has both a capable government in the sense we talked about, just having competence and not being overrun by corruption, and a strong civil society that can hold that government accountable. So making sure you have a robust civil society, I think, is going to continue to be even more important in the 21st century, so that both of those sort of institutional functions are working together and holding government to its core functions and preserving the space of freedom for the rest.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I just want to request, if I may ask you one final question, and I couldn't help but notice that's a very interesting question on the screen. And it says, Andrew Yang once said that non-government philanthropy can never scale up to the required level, and state-backed welfare state is indispensable. Do you agree?
I do not agree. I think one of the mistakes we make is, particularly in the U.S., which I know better, so I'll lean on that. But the growth of the welfare state did not fill a vacuum. It replaced mutual aid and civil society activity that preceded it. So I think it's a counterfactual that can't be upheld to say that without large-scale government philanthropy, you can't meet the needs of individuals, because he's comparing the level of non-government philanthropy in a world where it's been crowded out significantly. So I think it's certainly a fair question to have a debate about, but I think there is so much to point to in terms of really effective temporary personal support and professionally organized support in the private sector for mutual aid, for solving that problem. I mean, the idea that people don't solve their own problems collectively has been thoroughly debunked by most recently Nobel Prize winner Eleanor Ostrom.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'd like to now give it to Yazid.
It was a fantastic discussion, Matt. It was great learning more about the book and about the variety of ways we can do development differently. And these ideas are important for us and all around the world because the traditional orthodoxy doesn't work. And we'd like to be rich too. If not as rich as the United States, at least as rich as South Korea, as I mentioned, which in the 1950s used to be as poor as us, and today is 15 times richer. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say that I think it's important that in this 21st century and what's going on right now, I want you to be rich too. I don't believe that countries are competitors. I think we're allies, and that we should be cheering each other on to success, and that it's a win-win when we do that.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for having joined us for the conversation today. We request you to share the quick feedback form that we have shared with you on chat.